Manifesto of the Free Humans, Chapter 7, Stewardship of the Earth. Regardless of your thoughts on anarchist or statist theory, every single human being on this planet needs clean water and the fruits of the earth to survive. The earth is our home and our source of life, and it is not something that is promised or guaranteed. This simple fact has been overlooked by our species as unsustainable practices continue to destroy our planet for the short-term gains of an elite few. The negative relationship that our species has with the Mother Earth is without a doubt driven by the authoritarian control structures and economic systems that dominate the world. If there was an award for the planet's biggest polluters, the governments and militaries of the world would undoubtedly take the prize, along with their corporate friends. In addition to making a mess of the world on their own, global governments suppress clean and renewable energy technology, which in turn forces the rest of us to use unhealthy products that damage our bodies and environment. There are several competing philosophical views when it comes to the environment and the concept of ownership. We cannot deny that our species' time here on this planet is finite, while the Earth will be here for many, many future generations. With that being the case, it hardly makes sense to consider ourselves the owners of the land, the water, or other resources which predate and will outlast our existence. We take a view of the ownership of Earth that could be more correctly termed stewardship. Essentially, each of us are caretakers of the life on this planet, whether we choose to accept the role or not. This does not mean that all claims to property should be abandoned, but it does imply a certain amount of personal responsibility in relation to the living standards of future generations. We must acknowledge that for much of recent history, humanity has been a poor caretaker of the planet. Still, we reject the notion that government bureaucracy is the answer to destruction of the environment. Ironically enough, it is the governments and international governing bodies in charge of protecting the environment who are largely responsible for the dismal condition of our habitat. It is often the state and scientific establishment that push the propaganda that the average citizen is the source of all of our environmental woes. In June 2015, a group of scientists from Stanford University, Princeton University, the University of California, Berkeley, and others warned that the Earth is experiencing a sixth mass extinction era. They called for fast action to save endangered species and habitats. The scientists claim that species are disappearing at up to about 100 times faster than the normal rate between mass extinctions, known as the background rate. Their study was published in the journal Science Advances. The researchers told Stanford that their estimates were conservative and that the situation may be much worse than previously believed. Quote, "We emphasize that our calculations very likely underestimate the severity of the extinction crisis because our aim was to place a realistic lower bound on humanity's impact on biodiversity," end quote, they wrote. Paul Ehrlich, the Bing Professor of Population Studies and Biology, a senior fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and co-author of the study, said, quote, "The study shows without any significant doubt that we are now entering the sixth great mass extinction event." Of course, it is absolutely important for free hearts and minds to strive to live an existence that is in balance and harmony with the planet and all life we share this space with. And it is true that this is not currently happening. Environmental damage is taking place, but the study ignores the impact government institutions have on the environment, and it places the blame solely on the average consumer. While it is true that the average consumer does play a role in environmental pollution, their impact is minuscule in comparison to that of governments and major corporations. Also, one of the reasons the average consumer uses toxic products in the first place is because more sustainable alternatives are forced off the market. Also, Professor Ehrlich's involvement might set off a few alarms for those familiar with the topic of eugenics. Eugenics is the belief that humans can be improved or controlled through genetic or social engineering. In 1981, Ehrlich wrote the book Extinction: The Causes and Consequences of the Disappearance of Species. Before that, Ehrlich co-wrote Ecoscience, which sheds some light on his ideas. Published in 1977 with John Holdren, former science czar for the Obama administration, Ecoscience promotes a number of radical ideas for dealing with the world's population. Some of these ideas include forced abortions enforced by a global police force, which requires the loss of individual sovereignty. Quite simply, these people want the public to believe that humanity is a disease, something to be managed, controlled, or eliminated. The same people responsible for most of this environmental degradation also create nature-based foundations and other phony environmental organizations. These organizations are used to stash money and often advance eugenics depopulation programs. The ruling class understands that human beings naturally have an interest in preserving the environment and that most people will typically not question or criticize actions taken in the name of environmental protection. The latest scheme of the ruling class is exploiting environmentalism and fears of global warming to establish a carbon credit taxing system. The rationale of this theory is that human beings are creating environmental destruction via their use of carbon, so the suggested solution is to tax the average people and control their energy use. If climate change is actually a result of man-made carbon output, then surely taxation wouldn't be a realistic solution, yet according to the establishment, this is the only possible solution. Yet the average citizens aren't responsible for the majority of the world's environmental destruction, nor are they responsible for the majority of the world's carbon output. In fact, the 50 largest transport sea vessels produce more carbon than all the cars in the world. These are military vessels, oil tankers, and other transport vehicles for corporations and governments. Howard Zinn's incredible research in A People's History of the United States of America reveals that, quote, in 1992, more than 100 countries participated in the Earth Summit Environmental Conference in Brazil. Statistics show that the armed forces of the world were responsible for 2/3 of the gases that deplete the ozone layer. But when it was suggested that the Earth Summit consider the effects of the military on environmental degradation, the United States delegation objected and the suggestion was defeated. End quote. The general public is not to blame for the environmental crisis that stands before us. We have inherited it from the careless governments and corporations who suppress alternative energy sources and are responsible for the vast majority of the world's pollution. The perpetrators of these crimes place the blame everywhere but themselves and use their political power so they can actually benefit from all the destruction they are causing. Al Gore was one of the most prominent spokesmen for the carbon-based global warming theory. He is also one of the primary advocates for a worldwide carbon tax and is closely involved with businesses that stand to reap large profits as a result of possible carbon tax schemes. He says his motivations are to reduce the energy use of the general public, but according to the Tennessee Center for Policy Research, he has a mansion in the Belle Meade area of Tennessee which consumes more electricity every month than the average American household uses in an entire year. When this information went public, he defended himself by saying that he pays a, quote, carbon offset, but what he didn't say is that he paid it through a company that he owned called Generation Investment Management. In other words, he paid the money to himself. Al Gore became a proponent of carbon tax via his good friend and the founder of the embattled Enron Corporation, Ken Lay. This makes perfect sense considering the fact that Enron was an energy company which had very close ties in Washington and was notorious for concocting deceitful schemes to fleece the public out of their hard-earned money. To make matters worse, most of the evidence paints a picture quite different from the official stance on global warming. The Earth's temperature and climate has been changing and fluctuating since the beginning of time on account of various factors, namely solar activity. Drastic changes in weather have been recorded throughout history, and some would argue these changes are a natural process. To claim that a natural process that has been happening forever is evidence of a recent threat defies logic. Since the ClimateGate scandal broke in November of 2009, the carbon-based global warming theory has lost support and is now under extreme public scrutiny. Although politicians and mainstream media sources claim that there is some sort of a scientific consensus on this topic, there still exists a reasonable amount of skepticism within the scientific community itself. While all of this discussion and controversy is taking place over this very specific theory, there is a list of other environmental issues that are being ignored. Our energy resources are being poorly mismanaged by the organizations that control them. The governments and corporations are destroying the planet and placing the blame on us so they can justify making us foot the bill. The abundant use and lack of long-term studies on genetic engineering and pesticides has created new species of weeds and pests that pose an unprecedented threat to our ecosystem. Toxic radiation and pollution has become commonplace in our everyday environment, mostly due to corporate carelessness and military exercises. There are very serious environmental issues that we need to correct, but it's not limited to one chemical compound, and we aren't going to solve anything by taxing the average consumer. Without a doubt, the Earth is suffering. The planet is ravaged with environmental disasters, loss of important ecosystems and species, and a population that seems increasingly ignorant to the impact it is having on the rock that they call home. Every free mind should work to live in harmony with this planet and reduce the impact of our existence on this beautiful, unique place we call Earth. That is without question. What we should question, however, are the motives for governments and other parasitic classes who promote the idea that humanity is the problem that needs to be corrected. Another recent environmental issue which divided activists, particularly the American Libertarian Movement, was the 2016 fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline near Cannonball, North Dakota. The DAPL, otherwise known as the Bakken Pipeline, is owned by the Dallas, Texas-based corporation Energy Transfer Partners. The pipeline is slated to stretch 1,172 miles upon completion and transport crude oil from the Bakken fields of North Dakota to Patoka, Illinois. The project is set to cross the Missouri River not far from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. The Standing Rock Sioux claim that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers violated the National Historic Preservation Act by not properly consulting them before approving the project. The Sioux filed suit against the Army Corps and in April 2016 launched the Sacred Stone Spirit Camp as a site of resistance to the pipeline. Protesters, allies, and journalists came from all around the world in support of the Spirit Camp, as well as additional camps that were launched in support, including the Red Warrior Camp, Rosebud Camp, and Ocheti-Sakawan. Beginning in August 2016, the number of tribes and indigenous communities standing in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux grew to over 500. The coming together of such a large number of tribes, many of whom have been enemies in the past, was a historic event in itself. Beyond the lack of consultation with the natives, the water protectors, as the Sioux and allies prefer to be called, were fighting against the property claims of the U.S. government. Technically, according to the U.S. government, the water protectors in Ocheti-Sakawan camp north of the Cannonball River were on private property owned by the U.S. In October 2016, the protectors launched an additional camp closer to the construction of the pipeline. The Sioux called this the Treaty or Frontline Camp, named for the 1851 Laramie Treaty under which the Sioux still maintained ownership of the land. The Sioux stated that they were implementing their own form of eminent domain and retaking the area because the U.S. government has failed to abide by its own treaties. In order to prevent the completion of the pipeline, which the Sioux and water protectors see as not only a violation of treaties, but an attack on the water and the planet, the camps were willing to risk arrest by using direct action to physically stop the construction of the pipeline. Some critics of the water protectors argue that they are in the wrong for going on private property and forcing the cops to use violence in defense of said property. We completely disagree with this misguided view. Anarcho-capitalists, libertarians, conservatives, and other proprietarians who take this position are completely ignoring the history of broken treaties between the U.S. and indigenous communities of the landmass currently known as North America. This is particularly disturbing to see coming from followers of Austrian economist Murray Rothbard. Drawing on John Locke's Homestead Proviso, Rothbard argued that individuals who mix their labor with unused property can become legitimate owners. Quote, "The homesteading principle means that the way that the unowned property gets into private ownership is by the principle that this property justly belongs to the person who finds, occupies, and transforms it by his labor," Rothbard wrote in Confiscation and the Homestead Principle, The Libertarian Forum, June 15, 1969. This is clear in the case of the pioneer and virgin land, but what of the case of stolen property? End quote. Rothbard goes on to say that when dealing with stolen property, one must make an effort to find the legitimate owner. This means the original person who homesteaded the land or the person who legitimately acquired the property from that original owner. If unable to locate the original owner, the person who was last in possession of the property without the need for status privilege becomes the proper owner. While we have criticisms of other stances taken by Rothbard, particularly his stances on agorism, cultural issues, and his later adoption of paleoconservatism, we agree with him on this issue. This means that Energy Transfer Partners, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and private citizens who sold their land for the pipeline cannot be considered the legitimate owners of the land in question, especially not when this land has historically been used by the Sioux Nation and was only acquired by an agency of the U.S. government through violent wars and broken treaties. Rothbard also responds to the critics who believe that the water protectors should respect the private property rights of the oil company and attempt to fight the battle in court. Quote, "What of the myriad of corporations which are integral parts of the military-industrial complex, which not only get over half or sometimes virtually all their revenue from the government, but also participate in mass murder? What are their credentials to private property? Surely less than zero. As eager lobbyists for these contracts and subsidies, as co-founders of the Garrison State, they deserve confiscation and reversion of their property to the genuine private sector as rapidly as possible. To say that their private property must be respected is to say that the property stolen by the horse thief and the murdered must be respected." End quote. Frankly, these corporations do not have rights and should not be granted the same property protections as people. Without subsidies and state-granted privilege, these corporations would not be able to maintain their monopoly on energy. The corporate oligarchy and their state partners also work together to suppress alternative energy technologies that have the potential to outcompete the oil barons. Another point of contention in the DAPL debate has been the fact that the movement views itself as defenders of the sacred Mother Earth and natural resources. The fight between the water protectors and the oligarchy is best seen as a cultural divide. The indigenous people of this planet tend to think in terms of the principle of the seventh generation. This means that one considers the effects of their actions on not only the next generation, but the 7 coming generations. This perspective differs greatly from the opposing view that could be termed the modern or Western worldview, which tends to focus exclusively on the here and now. It is this type of thinking that perpetuates the use of oil and other invasive, unsustainable products. The water protectors, specifically the indigenous communities, are fulfilling their spiritual commitment to defend the land and the water. Many of them do not care about debates over whether the direct action was a violation of private property norms. There are individuals who are often willing to die in defense of the planet. We believe this is an honorable position that could be supported while still being consistent about not initiating force or even violating property rights. For example, one could argue that a homesteader who causes irreversible harm to their property is initiating force against future generations of property owners and the planet itself. Additionally, damage done to one piece of property will undoubtedly lead to contamination of adjacent properties due to the interconnected nature of the environment. What this means is that polluters themselves are actually committing the first act of aggression and would thus open themselves up to consequences from their neighbors. We believe this position is sound based on property claims as well as an argument for defending the undefendable. In Book 1 of this series, we mention the need for humanity to rethink our relationships with non-human animals on the planet. We discussed the implications of consciousness and rights applied to animals and the environment. Although some will argue that animals are incapable of rational thought and therefore incapable of being considered anything other than property, we have come to the conclusion that animals should be given equal status to children, the elderly, adults with diminished mental capacity, or similar vulnerable groups incapable of self-defense and reason. With each of the groups, it is generally accepted that a guardian or agent of the vulnerable individual would be justified in defending them against the initiation of force. This same logic can be applied to animals and potentially the earth in reasonable circumstances. For example, if you witness your neighbor abusing their dog for no good reason, you may feel called upon to ask them to cease and desist. If that fails, you could gather your freedom cell and issue a warning. If that also fails, to end the violence, you may consider physically removing the dog from the abusive owner. If the owner views his dog as property, he may consider you to be aggressing upon his legitimate claim to ownership and choose to respond violently. At this point, we have 2 individuals who believe they are in the right. The situation could be arbitrated between competing insurance agencies, but would likely lead to one agency recognizing the rights of animals and the other agency denying such protections. Until there is a global shift in the perspective of our relationship with animals, we are likely to see a continued debate over whether they are property. Still, we were drawn to anarchism because we desire a world without systematic, publicly accepted violence. Viewing animals as property to be used for entertainment is the type of thinking that leads to orcas trapped in captivity at SeaWorld and miserable animals held prisoner in zoos. Should we not hold ourselves to a higher standard and live a compassionate life in balance with the animals and the environment? We are not advocating a fascist vegan takeover where every individual is forced to abandon meat eating. In fact, one of the authors of this book is vegan and the other is not. We don't have any intention of sending one another to the gulags or re-education camps. However, we do advocate a more conscious relationship with the animal nations and the earth. We also call on those concerned with dangers to the environment and animals to boycott factory farming industries, including most mainstream restaurants and non-organic, non-local produce which involve the heavy use of dangerous pesticides. Mass factory farms are damaging to the surrounding environments and also perpetuate the disturbing slavery and abuse of animals bred to feed the human population. Not to mention that animal agriculture is responsible for a large portion of greenhouse gas emissions. If you want to fight deforestation and carbon emissions, stop supporting animal agriculture. Statism is also responsible for propping up the corporations involved in industrial farming and animal agriculture. Without statism, and with an increase in the counter-economy and agorist localization, factory farms and the abuse to the environment and animals caused by them would be greatly reduced. If we grow the urban farming and backyard gardening movements, we could decrease the need for such unsustainable and violent industries. This won't be a perfect vegan world where no one eats meat, but it would greatly reduce the acceptable level of violence used against animals in the earth. Our final point relates to the question of who is best suited to tend to the local environment. The common refrain from the authorities is that the people are ill-equipped to handle management of local resources and protection of the environment. We are told that without a government, the environment would become sold off to the highest bidder and polluted. However, recent research seems to contradict these claims. A July 2014 report from the World Resources Institute and the Rights and Resources Initiative found that communities take better care of forests than governments. The report, Securing Rights, Combating Climate Change, reviewed over 130 earlier studies in 14 countries to see the effect of community management of resources. According to the report, areas of the Brazilian Amazon under control of the indigenous communities saw a deforestation rate of 0.6%, while government-held areas were at 7%. In Guatemala, the rate of forest loss in government-protected areas was 20 times that in areas under community control. The World Resources Institute report confirms a 2012 analysis by the Institute of Ecology, which found that on average, government-protected tropical forests were cut down about 4 times as fast as community-managed ones. Finally, the work of Elinor Ostrom perfectly illustrates the benefits of community environmentalism versus state environmentalism. Ostrom, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, found that problems with resource management occur when outside forces, including governments and well-meaning conservationists, intervene. It is clear that humanity needs to reevaluate our relationship with the planet and all of its inhabitants. Rather than looking to governments or elites to save the day, we should be focused on how we can take action that will defend the livelihood of those living today and future unborn generations. This action may sometimes involve directly challenging the mechanisms of power that attempt to damage and control the planet in ways that affect our very existence. We should strive to remain consistent with our goal of not initiating violence while at the same time standing strong as warriors in defense of the earth.